Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to IT Social Sciences Great Problem, Great Minds seminar series. For today's seminar, I would like you to know you can submit your questions during the webinar by typing in the chat box. We will open the floor to questions at the end of our webinar. Today's speaker is Professor Jerry Shannon. Jerry Shannon is an associate professor in the Department of Geography and the Department of Financial Planning, Housing, and Consumer Economics at the University of Georgia. He received his PhD from the University of Minnesota in geography. He's the director of Community Mapping Lab and an assistant director of the Housing and Demographics Research Center at the University of Georgia. He is the current chair of the Community Geographies Collaborative. His research studies how to make urban neighborhoods and food systems healthier and more equitable. His broad interests are in urban development and inequality, geographic information systems, and place impacts on health. More specifically, his research focuses on the role of maps and spatial analysis in shaping our understanding of hunger, housing, poverty, and neighborhood development. He is also interested in the role of participatory research methods in mobilizing community action around these issues. His work has been supported by major research grants from the U.S. Department of Agriculture. He has published widely on topics related to community geography, food access, critical GIS, and housing in top journals, such as the Annal of the American Association of Geographers, Progress in Human Geography, Social Science and Medicine, and Health Affairs. His work were also reported by popular national and local media outlets, such as ABC and Elson's Banner Herald. Is very glad to welcome Professor Jerry Shannon.
All right, thanks so much for that introduction and for this opportunity to speak to you all. I'm going to go ahead and share my slides here. So let me go ahead and do this. Share screen one. Good. And I'll just double check. Can you all see these slides okay?
Yeah.
Okay, awesome. So thanks again for having me. So just a quick little bit about me. You already heard quite a bit in that introduction, but I define myself as a community geographer. My job is hired as a community geographer, which means I'm focused on doing a lot of community engaged research and teaching here a lot in Athens, but also around Georgia as a whole, and focus on food systems, housing, community development, and some of the things that you've heard there. I'm going to talk a little bit today. It's going to be a little of a kind of here's what I've been researching the last, 10 years or so now, related to food systems particularly, and kind of weave some narratives together of here's some things I think are important and given where we're at in this moment. So as I said, the talk today is going to be just talking a little about this term food deserts, which I'm guessing many of you are familiar with. Certainly in Chicago, it's gotten plenty of play in public policy and in terms of the interventions that have gone on in the city. And I'm going to tell you why we shouldn't talk about food deserts. What are some of the problems with that terminology and the conceptualization of these particular areas of low food access? And then talk through a couple of alternatives of other ways to think about how we study food access. One of them is what I'm going to call studying up the food system, and the other one is acknowledging agency of neighborhood residents and working with that. And then I'll just conclude with some final thoughts. So let's just start with a definition of food deserts. So this is a term that's now about 20 years old. It first originated in some British policy initiatives back in the late 90s. The first real article that made it popularized is this one by Neil Wrigley, which came out in a special issue of Urban Studies in 2002. The term itself reportedly came from a resident of a Scottish housing project who said that they felt like they lived in a food desert, right? And I think it's caught on to the imagination. It's gotten a lot of currency for folks as a way to think about areas that just don't have great access to good food. Is kind of the basic idea. Now, the kind of the original British initiative that spawned the term and the research since then comes out of this broader framework, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with, called the social determinants of health. And the idea is rather than just focusing on nutrition education, just telling people what they're supposed to eat, let's think about all the other kind of macro level factors ranging from neighborhood food options through federal policy that shape the kinds of choices and foods they have available to them. And if we change some of those macro factors, that will then influence individual level behavior as well. So food deserts fit very much into that because we're thinking about what is the role of the food environment in people's dietary decision making. Within the United States, food deserts as a term became codified in the 2008 Farm Act. So once every 5 years, we redo the Farm Bill. And in 2008, that version of the Farm Bill included a section particularly focusing on food deserts. And so the definition that's on here, this is from a report that came a few years later from USDA, commonly referred to as food deserts. These regions of the country often feature large proportions of households with low incomes, inadequate access to transportation, and a limited number of food retailers providing fresh produce and healthy groceries for affordable prices. And this is, you'll hear variations on this definition, but I think it's important just to look at USDA as one of those ones that gets a lot of play, and it's about kind of this idea that there's just places where getting food is hard, right? Both because there's not a lot of great food options, and you have folks who are dealing with limitations on the kinds of transportation they have access to, the amount of money they can pay, things like that. Chances are, though, that when many of you think of food deserts, you think of a map that looks something like this one. So out of that same 2008 Farm Bill, we had this Food Access Research Atlas that was created by the USDA that has a list of census tracts that are classified as food deserts. These little pockets of areas where food access is just not that great. So for instance, in the city of Chicago, it looks something like this. You've got kind of this fringe that's in basically the inner ring suburbs, in the way that I would understand it, of census tracts are identified as what they call low income, low access areas. So it's a combination of low income populations and low access to healthy foods. I actually grew up right over here up in Barrington, not particularly close to a food desert. There's a little green area there in Carpentersville, which is a lower income community that was close to Barrington. But you can get an idea of what these maps look like. And you know, I've had a Google alert on with news stories about food deserts for, I don't know, probably going on 7 or 8 years. And regularly it just comes through of like, this neighborhood's a food desert. It's been a term that's been very useful, I think, for people wanting to advocate for better food options in local communities. The USDA's criteria for what counts as a food desert is that it has to be both, as I said, low income and low access. And low income means either 20% of the households or more live in poverty, or the median family income of that census tract is less than 80% of the state median income. So it's either the federal poverty line, which is a fixed rate, or some kind of relative measure based on the state's median income or metropolitan area. And then low access varies whether or not it's urban or rural. So in urban areas, you have to be at least 500 people, or 33% of the population is within 1 mile. It is more than 1 mile from the supermarket. So a third of the population is more than a mile from the supermarket. In rural areas, that distance extends to 10 miles. There's no suburban gradient in there. It's either you're in an urban area or you're not. And that's because suburban areas are notoriously hard to define. So that's kind of what food deserts are, right? And it's been the basis of a lot of policy initiatives since then. I don't have time here to kind of walk through all of them, and we're going to get to some research that's in response to this here in a second. But just to list off a couple of things that are good examples, this is probably the most notable one. So the state of Pennsylvania back in, I don't know, 2007, 2008, had an initiative they called the Pennsylvania Fresh Financing Initiative. It was championed by the Food Trust and some other partners there to provide a blend of public and private money to improve food options in low-income neighborhoods. That either meant creating new grocery stores or providing grants for existing stores to have better food options. That was federalized under the Obama administration in 2010. They announced this Healthy Food Financing Initiative that did a very similar kind of thing, but at the federal level. So using that food environment atlas, they would target areas that were low access and say we have grant money that can be used for to expand the available food options in these areas to make things better. So that was one of the that's been one of the main responses, and it's a pretty natural run, right? If you're looking at a map like this, what you're thinking is, oh, there's a problem. Let's see if we can just get a new store there, and we'll make that green square go away, right? We'll fix it. We'll make it better. Another one are initiatives like this. I mean, this is not completely different than the Healthy Food Financing Initiative, but you have a lot of projects around farmers markets or corner stores trying to improve the amount of options that are available in existing locations. And oftentimes this involves the city or some other group setting up a relationship with a vendor who will stock fresh food, um, freezer or fridge in some of these corner stores because the corner store owners don't necessarily have the capacity or even capital to be able to hold these. And so it's about making these food options more available in those neighborhoods. So we've had lots of efforts to basically kind of fix food deserts by providing better food options in those places. So it's been popular. People still talk a lot about it. It's got a federal website. Why shouldn't we talk about food deserts? Well, first of all, the research so far on the effectiveness of these interventions has been decidedly mixed. There are some studies that show some small improvements, but a lot of research looks something like this. So this is one of those Pennsylvania stores that opened up that I mentioned earlier. There was a study that was done, kind of a pre and post study by Steve Cummins, who I believe is at Penn State, or no, Stephen Matthews is at Penn State. Stephen Cummins is in the UK. And what they found is in the headline. This is in Health Affairs, right? New neighborhood grocery store increased awareness of food access, but did not alter dietary habits or obesity. Health in Place had another article. I think a couple years later, does opening a supermarket in a food desert change the food environment? If you can read the fine print down here, it says the supermarket opening in a food desert called little improvement in the net availability of healthy foods, challenging the underpinnings of policies. Now, this seems a little counterintuitive, right? You'd think opening a new grocery store would make things better. What was going on here? Well, I think there's a couple of issues. One is that food deserts presume that we have to measure from place of residence. And this is from my dissertation research. So this is from back from 2012, 2011. And part of this research was doing interviews with about 30, I think it was 39 individuals who lived in two different neighborhoods in Minneapolis, Minnesota. And as part of their involvement, I would interview them a couple of times, ask them about how they felt about the food options available to them. And then they actually had a cell phone that tracked their location for 5 days. And then we come back and talk about where did you go during these 5 days, and particularly using food diaries as well. Where did you get food? So what we have here is one individual who did that. And you can see their home is located right here, but their activity space, what we'd call their activity space, if we draw basically a polygon around those GPS points that were registered by the phone, was much broader. They spent a lot of time down here, I think, at a community center. And then even my sister's place up in Northeast Minneapolis, right, which is quite far from her home, but she spent a lot of time there. So it's not just about what store is close to your home, but what stores fit within this kind of zone of where you do activity over time, right? So it's not just a matter of having a store close to where you live, though certainly that matters to people. I think that's one of the issues, is that we're not really conceptualizing the issue well, because even people with limited transportation options are still mobile, and that was a pretty consistent finding through this. And people are able to go get food if they want to. There's another study that came out in 2013 that also found something similar. I'm just mentioning it here just to kind of confirm this. This was in Detroit, and they were mapping, again, low-income households living in Detroit, and they found that many folks went out into suburban areas to find to go grocery shopping, particularly for national supermarkets, because there wasn't a lot of national supermarkets nearby in their neighborhood. But you do see they did still shop in the neighborhood sometime as well. So it would be a mix of things, but a lot of different strategies that people use. More commonly, what I heard in my dissertation research in these interviews that I did with people was something that looks like this. Something to the effect of, I live in the hood in this low-income area, but I hate it. So this is a Cub Foods. It's in South Minneapolis. This store was actually looted during the riots after the George Floyd incident, Derek Chauvin incident last year. This Cub Foods was one of the two stores that people used most often, and they did use that store, but they didn't like it, right? So here's another Cub Foods. This is, for those of you who don't know, Minneapolis. This is the Jewel Osco, I guess, would be the equivalent in Chicago of Minneapolis. This is a Cub Foods on the north side of Minneapolis. And a lot of people shopped here when I talked to people in North Minneapolis, but they almost universally hated it. So one conversation we had in a focus group at the end of the study was, who's going to stop in North to go shopping? No one. No one wants to go shop over here. People get robbed. People hear stories of people getting mugged. There's crime everywhere. So there's lots of concerns about safety. There was perceptions that the stores were places where just everything was tighter and you'd be jostled all the time, and just didn't feel like a comfortable place to go. And so many times folks would go to the suburbs. Um, Also, I think there's issues with thinking about supermarkets themselves as inherently a positive influence, right? So this is a great book. If you haven't read it or heard of it before, you should go pick up a copy. Black Food Geographies by Shante Reese, who's writing about food access in Washington D.C. And she was talking about, particularly down in kind of the east end of D.C., opening a new Safeway store again to try to solve this problem of food access and food deserts, and how people really had a negative reaction to it. And their responses indicated a variety of concerns ranging from overcrowding to poor customer service and poor quality. Responses indicated that even when the Safeway was close or convenient, it was not often chosen as the first place to grocery shop for many residents, particularly those with transportation or more money. The idea here was just, even though there's a store there, it's not the store that the suburban communities get. And I heard this in North Minneapolis as well. There was routinely complaints about how high the prices were, how often things were out or not stocked, or how low the quality of the food was. So all supermarkets aren't created equal, that the investment wasn't the same. Um, and so like, and I would argue with that part of that is that supermarkets grew up with the suburbs. They grew up with the suburban market in mind, being able to pull from a large quantity of highly mobile folks, and that the model probably is a poor fit for particularly low income urban neighborhoods in a lot of cases for that reason, because it's just not the right market for it. It's not built to serve those markets particularly well. More conceptually, I think one of the main issues that I've seen come up with food deserts is, in essence, that they localize and bound a systemic problem. What do I mean by that? I mean that it's easy to think that the problem with food deserts is all these green polygons, and we just have to get rid of the green polygons. Rather than think about this as something that's more about a food system that is not designed to serve low-income neighborhoods well, it's not functional at a systemic level because it's not designed to serve these markets. And it's not just a matter of trying to create new stores. It's about thinking about what are ways that the food system itself kind of needs to change, or our understanding of the food system needs to change at a much broader level. The problem is not confined just to those green boxes, right? So the term that I've advocated for, and there's also the other term that I'll mention at the outset here, is food apartheid that gets used. The other term I've advocated for is supermarket redlining. Those of you who don't know the term redlining, this refers back to maps that were created during the 1930s by the Homeowners Loan Corporation, a federal institution that was meant to help bail out homeowners during the um, Great Depression. There's lots of recent research on these redlining maps. Kind of their role in this whole process is still under discussion. But when we talk about redlining, we're talking about the areas that were designated as red. That was high risk for lending. So that money often, it was seen as high risk for lending, and the result was that loans were less often made there. Those were often predominantly non-white areas, and the result was lower rates of home ownership because people didn't have the means to do so. And so when we're talking about redlining, what we're really talking about is a financial system that steers investment away from low-income neighborhoods, or that somehow diverts funds, extracts funds out of low-income areas. So the argument I make in this blog that was on the Atlanta Studies page is that I'm just going to read off the second half of this quote. By reframing the ways that we describe food access, we can highlight how current disparities are the products of long histories of social exclusion. They are far from just natural or easy contained to just a few targeted neighborhoods. The alternatives we develop must then reckon with that system and rebuild its historically racist foundations. That is, we can't just patch a few holes. We have to recognize that this is part of a larger system that's produced a highly segregated and unequal landscape. And we can't separate the problem of food access from that in terms of what we do. So for the remainder of this time, I want to talk about two ways I've tried to kind of pursue that as a research agenda in terms of the kinds of questions I'm asking, the type of work that we do. The first side of this is going to be what I'm calling studying up the food system. Many of you have probably heard this term before. Studying up means kind of, rather than looking at folks who are relatively vulnerable or without much power, you're looking at the players who have a lot of power. within the system? How do we look up and not down when we're doing research? And what I mean by this in particular is paying attention to the system of food retail that has created these areas of low food access to begin with. So this is an article I did in Social Science and Medicine that was published back in 2018, looking at what happened to retail access using SNAP benefits, food stamp benefits during the Great Recession. And I'm not going to go into the main argument of the article, which is that it changed in certain neighborhoods and not others. But one of the things that stood out to me with this piece was I looked at what are called combination stores within the parlance of SNAP store classification. Basically, small stores, corner stores included. You can see here pharmacies, dollar stores, primarily. And I expected that in general, we'd see that these stores are all kind of clustered in low-income core neighborhoods, and that wasn't what I saw. And this was really striking to me. So if we just take dollar stores, what you'll see here is that for Dollar General. So for those of you who aren't familiar with the Atlanta metro area, the city of Atlanta is right here in Fulton County. This is the highest population density area. And Dollar General basically formed a ring around there. They opened new stores around the city in maybe inner ring suburbs, but not in the city itself, right? And actually, its concentration was much more in the suburbs compared to a store like Family Dollar, which is almost completely centered in those highest density and poorest areas of the metro area. And Dollar Tree, which has some parts of, say, Fulton County here, but is in the North Metro mainly, which is actually one of the most affluent parts of the city. And so I thought this was a really interesting trend because it was not what I expected when you think about what the reputation of dollar stores are. So as a follow-up to that, I did some research on this, and I said, let's just look at dollar stores and spend some time thinking about how their locational practices match up with the demographic landscapes that they inhabit, the social landscapes that they inhabit. Do these stores seek out particular types of neighborhoods, right? And the difference there is rather than thinking of food deserts, it's this thing that just kind of happens that we have this kind of almost ecological framework of stores that just kind of find their habitat and kind of range there, and it's this natural economic system that instead we conceive of these stores as active participants in that landscape, people who seek out places to invest capital in order to make profit, and do so based on what they think is strategically important to them. That they are actors. They are not just kind of part of the result of free market activity, right? That they make deliberate choices, and we should pay attention to what those choices are, or at the very least, what the effects of those choices are. And so this is a piece that was published in the Annals of the American Association of Geographers. The date there is 2021, but it came out officially last year, asking this question. And for this analysis, this is a little more, well, before we get to the actual analysis, let me just show you this because everybody loves a good GIF or GIF, depending on what you say. This is where I miss being with people and being able to like crack jokes and hear laughter. So sorry I can't hear y'all. But this is a map of dollar store spread from 2008 through, I think it's going to go up through 2019. Yeah. So, I mean, pay attention to Family Dollar. There's this initial jump that I think has to do with a bunch of Family Dollars becoming authorized to receive SNAP benefits. But you can see, for instance, like throughout much of the country outside the Southeast, even within this, well, not necessarily within the Southeast, but like in all of this area, there's this massive growth of dollar stores. That's also true for Dollar Tree. It's true to a lesser extent with Dollar General. But I remember looking at the map for Minnesota, right, and noticing how there was almost nothing there in 2008. And if you look at Minnesota over the course of this time frame, they just completely populate the state during the course of this time. They've had massive growth. It went from something from like 16,000 stores to 30,000 stores during this time period. And so I was interested in looking just at urban areas. I think there's an important story probably to tell about dollar stores in rural areas, but that wasn't the story that I looked at for this paper. I looked at the 3 largest metropolitan areas in each census division. So there are, I believe, 9 census divisions in the United States. I picked the 3 largest metros in each area and said, what were dollar stores doing in those areas, and how did that relate to patterns, particularly patterns of neighborhood segregation and low income? So I did 2 different types of analysis for this. The first one was repeated cross-sectional models. So what that meant was I looked at 2008, I believe, 2011, and 2015. And I said for each of those years, what was the relationship between neighborhood segregation and poverty to distance to the closest dollar store? So basically, were stores closer in some types of neighborhoods than others in each year? I wasn't tracking across years. In the second one, I did a first difference model that is, I said, what's the change between 2008 and 2015 in the distance to dollar stores by census tract, and how did that compare to the changes in the underlying demographics? So both of those are questions about how does dollar store placement relate to neighborhood segregation, but it's measuring it in two slightly different ways. So let me walk through the results of this real quick, and this is probably the most technical that this talk is going to get. So distance is often a variable that gets logged in regression analysis to make it more normal. And the result of that is that the coefficients that you get out of that model are percent changes. So let me just kind of explain what that means. That means that in 2008, in neighborhoods that were classified in the system I used, called mixed metro, as white low diversity neighborhoods, the closest dollar store was in general about 14% further away than it was in what I have as a reference group, which is white moderate diversity neighborhoods. So in white low diversity neighborhoods, stores in average were 14% farther because it's about 1.14. Whereas in what are called black moderate diversity neighborhoods, those stores, this is about 0.78. So it'd be about 22% closer than they were in white moderate diversity neighborhoods. Right. So if it's higher than 1, it means those stores were further away generally than they were in the control group, which was white moderate diversity. It was the most numerous census tract that was there, which is why I picked it. And if it's lower than 1, it means the stores were closer. So a couple trends to notice here. First of all, I think it's pretty clear that particularly for Family Dollar, right? For not so much for Dollar General and Dollar Tree, but we see for Family Dollar, these stores are much closer to Black neighborhoods and Latino neighborhoods in these metro areas than they were for white moderate diversity neighborhoods, right? And that was true for stores as a whole, and even in cases where, for instance, here Dollar General was further away than it was in white moderate diversity neighborhoods in 2008. But by the end of this period in 2015, it was closer when we did the model there, right? So I think that's important to note. First of all, we see clear evidence that these stores are generally locating closer to communities of color, controlling for poverty and high income households. We see for high income households, these stores generally don't show up close by very often, right? Second thing to notice that for white low diversity neighborhoods, these stores are uniformly farther away. So kind of 80% or higher white population, that stores are generally further away than they are elsewhere. And then also, I thought this was really interesting that for Dollar Tree, remember if you remember this map that was back here a little ways, right? How Dollar Tree was locating in the North Metro of Atlanta, that was a national trend that fit with the pattern I was seeing here, that for areas with high percentage of poverty, right? So the way to interpret this is for each percent increase in the poverty rate, a store gets roughly 10% further away than it would be in one that had a 1% lower poverty rate. And that's just for Dollar Tree. So that there's a clear evidence that store is a little bit different. And that matches up with other anecdotal evidence I've heard that Dollar Tree is more about kind of party supplies and it's catering for like teachers and educators and things like that versus Dollar General and Family Dollar. And the last thing I'll just note with this is that controlling for both the distance of supermarkets and grocery stores, so these are like the big chain stores and then smaller like independent or local chains, that we see that as those stores are further away, so are dollar stores. So this isn't here evidence that dollar stores are locating in kind of gaps where supermarket distance is high or where supermarkets are far away, then the dollar stores come in. What it says is if the supermarkets are far away, then the dollar stores are probably kind of far away as well. So they're co-locating together in these cases. So I think those were all pretty notable responses. For that second half of these responses, the first difference models. This one is a little more mixed. Most of these coefficients are pretty small magnitude, and given the time constraints here, I'm not going to go into a lot of them. I will highlight this one. So this was change between 2008 and 2015. And the one finding here that I do think was notable, it's a little different here, by the way, and this is change in miles is the coefficient, that there's a negative 0.2 coefficient with Family Dollar and grocery distance. What that means is that as grocery distance increased by 1 mile, over the course of that time period, 2008 to 2015, the distance to the closest Family Dollar decreased by 0.21 miles. So that Family Dollar was coming into places where grocery stores were leaving. Now, was that grocery stores being driven out by Family Dollar? Was that Family Dollar kind of filling in? We don't know. It conflicts a little bit with what we saw back here. But I think there's some evidence there that Family Dollar is kind of filling in, at least in some of these urban neighborhoods. So the kind of closing argument here in this piece, through analysis of dollar stores and similar spaces of precarious consumption, future work can outline the ways which retailer redlining shapes neighborhoods' identities, physical health, and economic possibilities. In doing so, can not only uncover persistently inequitable retail landscapes, but also highlight their connection with a long history of racial discrimination and economic exclusion. And I think that's important, particularly if you think about things like dollar stores that are kind of filling in the gaps in an increasingly precarious labor economy. That these stores are coming in and serving neighborhoods whose residents are working in service sector jobs, who may be doing gig economy types of things with, say, Uber or Lyft or these kinds of jobs. And these stores fit that kind of life, right? They're just in time, providing what you need to get by for today. Um, and we have to think about their locational strategies kind of reflecting that emerging economy. Okay. So the second kind of big piece here, and then I'll move towards some final thoughts. And this one doesn't have any numbers at all. Acknowledging the agency of neighborhood residents. What do I mean by that? I mean, so coming back to this picture of Cub Foods, another comment that somebody made, I mentioned that there was complaints often about the high prices of foods in these stores. One of the women I talked to had this great quote. It could be your grandmother or my grandmother that has to come over to this high Cub and pay $4.99 a pound for ground beef. You might as well stick a gun to my head because it's robbery. And actually, that accusation of criminal activity was really common. People thought that the people running these stores were, in fact, criminal, that they were exploiting people in the neighborhood by charging these high prices for lower quality goods. And I think what that points to is like, again, I think a lot of these food desert maps tend to frame neighborhood residents as kind of passive and stuck in place, when in actuality, the folks that I talked to were actively kind of figuring out how to make do in the landscape and the choices they had available to them. And oftentimes would go quite far out. There's a woman who lived across the street from this Cub Foods and would drive 8 miles once a week to another Walmart to go get stuff that was on clearance. To get food. They were active participants in this landscape, and I think oftentimes it's easy to forget that. And so, as someone who's committed to doing, say, participatory or engaged research, I think there's ways that we can do these projects that are more capitalizing or drawing from or partnering with those folks. Right. So I'm going to briefly describe here a project that I and some other folks here at UGA did with the Atlanta Community Food Bank a few years ago called Stabilizing Lives. The idea was that the Atlanta Community Food Bank they wanted to think about new models of food provisioning, food pantries that would better serve the actual barriers that clients were facing to help them get to a place of stability and be able to move out of being in a precarious or state of crisis, things like that. So we did a 4-step process here. I won't go into a lot of it. I can talk more about it in Q&A if folks are interested. But we had a set of initial focus groups at each of 5 local food pantries that included staff, volunteers, and clients, where we kind of talked about what are the issues that matter to you in terms of the things that drive food insecurity. Then we worked with clients to do a photo voice or photo elicitation activity, where we asked them to take pictures of their food world. And you can see a couple of examples of those here. So they'd all submit a bunch of photos. We'd talk about those photos with them. And then they'd pick out 5 photos that would go into what we called a photo deck. And in some final focus groups, people took these photos, and it was often around, say, 30 or 40 of them, and sorted them together and grouped them around issues of common themes. And we talked about what those photos kind of showed about their food world. And a lot of this had to do with issues around food access and how they are able to procure food or not procure food. So let me give you a couple of examples of those, because I think these are really one of the things I like about photo elicitation is it's just more engaging, and I think it frames it in a really visceral kind of way. So this is one photo that was taken by one of our participants. This is a theme that comes up a lot in research when you look at food insecurity. She took a picture. If picture's a little grainy, it was on her camera, but there's a calendar, there's an EBT card, a Kroger Plus card for shopping, coupons, and money. She said $5, 5 days until we get our food benefits. This was the caption. $3 left to our name. Should I spend it on meat for dinner or use it for gas to get to the grocery store? Better save it to pay the tax on my coupons. And the idea here was kind of that idea of how do you stretch these dollars, which is something that comes up a lot as I said. A lot of participants liked this photo and talked a lot about it. They thought it really illustrated what they were experiencing in terms of the clients specifically. Here's another one. Um, a set of photos from the same person of her making food, and is interesting. So I remember the conversation we had about this. On one level, it's just like, here's a bunch of meals she's making. But one of the things that came out as we talked about this in those final focus groups is all these meals weren't just for her, they weren't just for her family, it was for a whole extended network of family and friends that she helped care for, even as she herself was experiencing a lot of food insecurity. And we talked a lot about those relationships of care that in a lot of ways are undermined by anti-hunger programs that make it difficult to get access to food. So for instance, you cannot spend SNAP benefits on people who live outside your household. At many food pantries, you are limited about how much food you can pick up for yourself, even if you do care for other people, and how many times you can visit. And so, and how in a lot of ways that undermines the kinds of relationships of care that bring stability, right, for these households, that you know that your neighbor or your friend or your sister or your auntie are gonna um, be able to take care of you if you're having a hard week, right? But the systems that we have to help support these folks don't recognize that, in a lot of ways really individualize the problem of food insecurity in a way that's not very helpful, right? And then this is one other one. So as I said, when we were done, participants kind of grouped these photos together, and then we presented them all together to say, like, here's how these um, photos clustered together. Like, here's the photos that tended to get grouped together. This one photo here was taken by one of our participants, and you can see it's kind of it's the top of a gallon of milk, and there's a bunch of crusty stuff on it. It's kind of looks kind of gross a little bit. And the caption says, "We're excited to get 4 gallons of fresh milk from a food pantry. It was spoiled though. The kids were upset. I couldn't fix it." And she talked about how upsetting it was. They waited in line, that spent gas money to go get stuff, and they got this great milk, and then they got home, and it was all awful. When we talked about this in the focus group, it's interesting because the agency, the food pantry staff who were part of that focus group said, "Well, you should have told us, right? That something was bad with this milk, and we would have tried to fix it for you." And the response from the client was, "Well, if I told you, I was scared that I was going to get in trouble. I didn't want to complain." Right. So you can see actually what we wrote on here as notes. It's like, what they learned is you get what you get and you don't pitch a fit. That's the line. And that there's this kind of attitude and pointing to a lack of trust and a lack of communication between pantry staff and clients that I think was really helpful in that moment to talk about. And then the irony actually later on even is that the food bank who provided this food, it turns out this was non-homogenized milk that was like probably $7 a gallon in the grocery store, like non-homogenized organic milk. And it was clumped up because it wasn't homogenized, right? It wasn't actually bad in the first place, but that wasn't communicated to clients. And so there's all these ways that breakdowns happen in communication in the system that play into this larger problem of how people can get access to the food they need in order to get by um, every day. And I think this method really helped create space for those kinds of conversations in ways that just doing the spatial analysis misses, right? This is a much richer kind of picture of the ways that food access is lived on the ground. So let me talk about a few final thoughts, and then I'm happy to kind of take your questions. So just earlier, just about a month or two ago, I and some of my colleagues, I mentioned Deshante earlier, Debs Ghosh, Michael Widener, and Danny Block, who's at Chicago State University. Some of you might even know him. Had this piece published in American Journal of Public Health called More Than Mapping, and we kind of talked through some of the same things I'm talking with you about today in terms of this was meant for public health professionals to think through how do we go about actually mapping out food access? What are the things that we have to pay attention to, and offer some of the same critiques that you've heard. And then we close with a set of recommendations for how we can think about doing this. And I'll just run through those real quick here. So the first is tracing the mobility of neighborhood residents. And we've talked about this a little bit already, but thinking about how is it that people actually access the food system over time. And there's a lot of research. I think Michael Widener in particular has done a lot with this around tracing people's daily activity and the ways that we then kind of think about how that relates to the kinds of food they have available to them and the kinds of food they choose to access during that time. You can look at some of Michael's research. He's got a big study that just has some pieces coming out this year on that. The second one is longitudinal analysis of neighborhoods and their food options. So I think to me, this comes back to that dollar store study that I did and really thinking about again, food access isn't just a snapshot in time. It fits in this broader pattern of neighborhood development, and really paying attention to how does changing food retail options correspond with demographic changes that are happening, differences in community development, retail investment that are happening in these areas, and understanding how those two things are linked together over time, rather than just trying to fill holes in a map. And then the last piece of this is participatory mapping, which again is about kind of capitalizing on the kinds of knowledge and wisdom and insight people on the ground have about their own neighborhoods. And as we think about what does it really mean to kind of fill the gaps in food access, to talk with the people who experience those gaps, to get their input beyond just having them even do GPS surveys, but actually talk with them about, what do you think of a store here? What do you think a store would work here? What do you like about the stores that you have and not like about the stores that you have? And include them as co-researchers or as focus groups and teams that can kind of give you feedback and perspective from where they're looking. Because oftentimes people outside the neighborhood might not have that same kind of life experience to speak from. So I think that all those three things I would say are super important to the ways that we think about maps. Can play a really important role, but they have to be embedded in a process that really thinks about the underlying mechanisms that drive food access or food insecurity within our neighborhood. So I will stop with that. Thanks so much for listening. I can't see your faces even during this time, but I'll go ahead and stop sharing. And I'm happy to take any questions that you all might have. Oh, I think I lost you. I can't hear anything. There we go.
Oh, okay.
There we
go. Thanks you for very interesting and insightful presentation. So I think Chris have more questions.
Yeah, well, I have a question, and maybe I just missed the argument here or whatever, but so are you saying that the dollar stores replace, I mean,
well, we don't know.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
I think like this, I was hoping this research could give an answer to that, because that is, I've talked to probably like 10 different reporters about dollar stores, because there's not a lot of research out there on them, and they're a big deal right now in terms of their growth. And that's the number one question that I get. And this evidence didn't say one thing or another. It wasn't, there wasn't a smoking gun that they were replacing grocery stores. And in fact, my guess is probably, if I had to say something without having the full evidence for it, what we've seen in the food system over the last 20 years is incredible consolidation in the supermarket industry. So, having Walmart become the nation's leading retailer in both rural and urban areas, that created a lot of voids, right? The smaller stores could not compete with that. And I think dollar stores in a lot of ways are then just filling in the gaps that were created by those big super centers, that they are they're the model that can work when you have a super Walmart.
Right. Well, I was interested because, I do some research on obesity. And so a lot of the argument about food deserts is that the food sources that are available in these areas, like dollar stores perhaps, carry sort of less nutritious food. So it's hard to get fresh produce or things like that at dollar stores. I don't think most of them carry that. Maybe some do, or a limited amount. Yeah, so the argument is that even if you have the access to those, don't have access to necessarily nutritious and healthy food, even if there's a place to buy something.
Right.
Yeah.
But I don't think the evidence is there that even if there is a grocery store close by, that it does that.
That's a sort of a different. I would agree with you. I think that it's not that purchase choices aren't necessarily driven by by the store. I mean, so you can walk into any grocery store and buy chips and pop and whatever, or buy lots of bread and pasta and things. And a lot of people do that because especially, the carbohydrate stuff, you can stretch your dollars further if you buy beans and rice and pasta. Those go further, they fill people up. And so if you have a limited amount of budget, they don't spoil. Right. So if you have a limited budget, those are actually sort of smart purchasing choices from a kind of an economic point of view, maybe not from a health point of view. So I think sometimes the arguments about food deserts get kind of pulled into these discussions about obesity. And I think I'm not sure if people have really been that clear about what that connection is. So there's sort of this argument that these food deserts lead to higher rates of obesity in those communities. And I don't know that we have as strong of evidence for that as maybe we would like to have or think we.
I think there's I think the only evidence that I'm kind of aware of that's somewhat solid is the linkage between fast food and then the residential environment and higher rates of obesity. But I don't think there's been hardly anything related to kind of the traditional measures of food access. That show that, and I think for all the reasons we're talking about, I think it's a lot more complicated. Honestly.
Yeah, so it's interesting. Thank you.
Okay. New Paul, you can ask what you.
Oh, thank you, Dr. Jerry, for your presentation. I was just like hoping to ask you an interesting question about whether if Walmart or Amazon had to like create a subscription to get nutritional food at a lower cost, whether it could potentially resolve the problem that we have in certain neighborhoods.
I mean, so that's an interesting question, and that's come up kind of increasingly, I think, given COVID certainly has everybody's getting everything delivered, while we were on lockdown.
Right.
And so I think like that's come up. I mean, the other main model, that is kind of similar to that is sometimes people do mobile markets. So like in Minneapolis, I think in Chicago, they've had this too, like food buses that go around to neighborhoods and like basically mobile farmers markets and things like that. I think, I mean, so my response is that that's not unsimilar to me to kind of the dollar store solution, because I think when we're playing the game of how can we get cheaper and cheaper food available to people, it's not solving the core problem, which is that people don't have enough money.
Yeah.
Right. And if it's always making things cheaper and cheaper, the people who are delivering those products are also not making a lot of money. Right. And there's a good percentage of Walmart staff that is on food assistance. And so I think that there are ways that could be helpful for folks who are homebound. I mean, same way of like, I think dollar stores serve a purpose, but the goal is to create a society in which we don't need those kinds of solutions is generally my line on those.
All right.
Where people are able to get access because they have the means to do so.
I because I'm not from the U.S., so I don't know so much about whether since Amazon purchased Whole Food, Whole Food, like whether the cost would be at the advantage of Amazon because they're probably always trying to put the cost down, as you just said. But we don't know. I don't know whether the nutrition is still kept properly in the same level.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I haven't looked enough into whether like Amazon does. I mean, the kinds of things that we pay attention to in the food access literature, meat and produce. I don't think either of those, my senses, are Amazon's strengths. That's not something that they're going to do. They'll do great on prepackaged stuff that's shelf stable, the same stuff that works well in corner stores because it doesn't go bad. You can ship it. You don't have to worry about conditions.
Yeah,
it's a lot harder to ship fresh foods.
Okay. So. Thank you so much, Doctor. Thank you.
Thank you.
Adam Anison.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Oh, I just want to say I really enjoyed the presentation, Dr. Jerry. And I just have a question regarding, I guess, I know you mentioned SNAP as a way for the government to sort of like help, I guess, this problem that we're facing with food deserts. Are you an advocate, or I guess what other like governmental level policies are you like an advocate for us to like, I guess, help this problem?
Right. So yeah, I mean, I think SNAP is really important for a lot of people, right? And it's important for retailers as well. The history of SNAP and for other folks in the food system. The history of SNAP is it started during the Great Depression. It was originally the government bought up surplus produce from farmers during the Depression so that they wouldn't face loss of their land and loss of their farms, and distributed it free of charge to people who qualified for the food stamp program. Retailers got upset about that. They wanted to be cut in on the deal. And so they developed this voucher system where the produce went to the retailers and then people could bring their food stamps and get the food that way. And I think SNAP plays a really vital role as a counter-cyclical kind of Keynesian economic stimulus during downturns. So in that sense, I'm supportive of it. At the same time, it's not solving the root problems, right? And in some ways, you can say it enables low-wage employment because it allows like retailers to get away or businesses to get away with paying substandard wages. So, I mean, my thing in terms of what are the programs that would improve food access, it's all the other stuff that promotes stability. So if you think about that picture with those dollar bills and what are they going to do with it? What are the other things that are stretching those, that are calling for those dollars? It's housing, it's healthcare, it's transportation, and it's like electricity. So programs that help support those, so better access to health insurance, right? Stronger systems of public transit, higher wage standards, higher minimum wage, all those things are federal responses that I think would impact people's ability to access food, even with the current system. And those would be the kind of things ultimately that I think we need to advocate for.
Thank you.
I also have a question is, so do you think for this Dollar Tree compared to, is the general, in fact, similar in fact with other like convenience stores?
You know, it's a good question. I think Dollar Tree, so Dollar Tree, by the way, also owns Family Dollar. It purchased Family Dollar back in like 2016 or 2017. And I think the store Dollar Tree, you know, I just don't think it serves the same role. Like, I'm almost inclined to think of it as a separate kind of thing. I think you can buy foods there, but it's different than Family Dollar and Dollar General, which function much more like what are called small box stores. So if Walmart's a big box store, those stores are small box stores that are meant to be kind of mini Walmarts essentially. And so I don't know that it has the same impact. Certainly it doesn't serve the same markets, right? It's clear that it's going for moderate to even high income neighborhoods compared to Family Dollar, which is going for, in some ways it makes sense that they bought Family Dollar because it's a completely different market segment that they're catering to with that store. And that Family Dollar is about like low income neighborhoods providing, you know, $1 food items, or I've heard it's going up to $1.25 food items for folks who don't have a lot of money to spend. And so I think they just serve kind of different purposes. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, sure. So in that case, do you think the further question is, do you think actually for our research, for the research we are doing, we should like distinguish these convenience stores to see which one actually have a better mode, especially in terms of the trade-off between the short-term benefit and the long-term maybe cost, since which we mentioned like even some convenience stores, they still have a limited like fresh or nutritious food, so they provide the short-term benefits, since for those neighborhoods people don't have other options, but in the long term actually they do have harm or cost on the communities.
Yeah, I mean that's one of my core arguments is that, so on the large level, right, supermarket chains even are not equal if they're treated that way in most of the public health literature on food access. So here in the South, Publix is not the same thing as Kroger, right? And they occupy different stores. It's not the same thing as Walmart. Publix is the upscale kind of brand versus Kroger is kind of where, you know, everybody shops. And it's not the same as Aldi, which is a smaller store, but that's the like I go for value kind of store. But yet when we analyze, we say supermarkets more general. And so the same thing with small stores that, for instance, like Walgreens in Chicago has models where they've got like a third of the store, I believe, or half of the store with fresh produce inside. And that's going to be very different than going to a CVS. And I think that those chain differences really do matter because, again, we think about these stores as agents, as retailers who are making specific decisions about what their business model is going to be and where they're going to locate, and they're not all the same. Ethnic markets are another one that I didn't talk about here, but like ethnic markets in urban neighborhoods provide great access to what would be considered healthy foods. But they often just go in the small retailer category and are treated the same as everybody else, or maybe they're a small grocery. But they kind of end up falling through the caps as a result.
Okay, thank you. I think Jamal Jodesh.
Yeah, before you went in on saying that some markets would form a ring around low-income neighborhoods, and like, why? Like, I don't get the reasoning behind it.
So why Dollar General would form a ring around low-income neighborhoods?
Yeah.
Well, I think that's just not their business model. I mean, Walmart is the same way. Honestly, Walmart doesn't go to the lowest income areas. It goes to the low to moderate income areas because there's like the lowest income areas just aren't as profitable. You can't make as much money there because people don't have as much money to spend, or at least discretionary income to spend. So, I mean, I don't know exactly why Dollar General doesn't see that as being a profitable market for them. But they clearly haven't. When you look at where their store is located, what they're looking for is for neighborhoods where people don't have a lot of money, but they've got some money to spend, and that's really their market as they've defined it. What we need, and someday maybe I'll do this research or somebody else will, is go and talk to these folks and think about how do they define what their markets are, if they would share that with us, and why don't they decide that this is a place that they can make lots of money. That's the best answer I've got for you. Does that make sense?
Yeah, thank you.
You have another question?
Yeah, I'm back. Sorry. Hello.
Yeah.
I was just curious because I know that we are one of the big problems that a lot of people cannot afford food. And so I was just I wanted to ask you what you think. What's your opinion over indoor farming, and whether would indoor farming, if it gets eventually cheaper, would it replace our ways of shopping food?
So are you thinking of this as like a indoor farming at an individual level or as business model level?
I think, or also in a business level, I saw it would make things perhaps cheaper, but this needs to be there still needs a lot of there still needs to be a lot of research, but the market is expected to grow by a lot in the next coming years. So
yeah, and so you're thinking about hydroponics and things like that.
Yeah.
So so this is, various systems of, for a long time, Will Allen up in Milwaukee had growing power as a model of this too, where he had fish eating the waste of the plants and then that gets fed back into the soil. I mean, I think those kinds of things, sure, they have a lot of, especially at the commercial level. Community gardening has long been posed as a solution to this. I think, my only reservations are those things when they're kind of treated as this is what the folks who have challenges can do, and the rest of us can just enjoy the food system we already have. So I think if we start thinking about ways to make those supply chains shorter, make the food system more resilient, and provide ways, particularly to support a more agile food system that doesn't rely on these huge box stores that have to have a huge footprint, that increases accessibility for people, but that takes a different set of policy choices around how we.
Oh yeah, there must be a policy change on yeah.
Yeah, I mean, the government subsidizes plenty of agricultural activity. They just don't subsidize stuff like that.
Yeah, but and what about the individual level? Would people invest on indoor farming, as it can be a good long-term investment, especially for big families?
Maybe. Yeah, I don't. That's something I don't know a lot about. So I'm not an economist in that sense. So I don't know if I would have a good sense of
Okay. Okay, no problem. Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay.
So related to that, wondering do you think at a little bit aggregated level, the farmer market will be more helpful in that case to help the provide nutritional food to the communities?
Yeah, so farmers markets has been one of the main kind of foci of alternative food work around food access. I think there's promise there. What the research thus far tells us is that for farmers markets to work well for low income folks, they can't be primarily a supplementary shopping option. So that is, they can't just have the purple carrots and the onions, and then you still have to go to Kroger, right? Because that just adds to the transportation burden. Ideally, they work in a way that's minimally, burdensome around transportation, so that for instance, when I lived in Minneapolis, they tried to do a bunch of these little pop-up farmers markets. There would be like one vendor or two vendors there for 2 hours a week. Like that doesn't work because when are they there and when can I get there? And I've got to go get my kids too. And like, it's got to be something that like is easy to get to and makes sense for it to work. And oftentimes, so for instance, the Minneapolis farmers market was really intentional about having wholesalers there who had other foods. So you could basically do your weekly grocery shopping there. Or there's here in Atlanta, we have the MARTA Fresh Market where they set up farmers market stands right outside the MARTA train station. You know, so in Chicago it'd be like a CTA farmers market where you get off the L or you get off the CTA and you've got farmers market options as you're going home, right? You can just stop and grab a few things. I think those kinds of models can have a lot of promise, and they support local food systems in a much more robust or helpful way.
Okay, I see. Thank you for these very valuable the responses. So I think we usually give the speakers.
Appreciate it.
Thank you so much for giving us the talks.
Yeah, thanks again for the invitation. It was a pleasure to speak with you all.
Thank you.
Yep.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you so much. Have a nice day.
You too. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you for the lecture.